Hey everyone! Welcome back to another episode of the Kindness Code. I'm your host, Adorlee, and today we've got a super exciting guest who's all about making education more inclusive and fair for everyone, Dr. Wortham. Dr. Wortham is the Charles F. Donovan S.J. Dean at Boston College's Lynch School of Education and Human Development. With over 30 years of experience in higher education, he's an expert in identity, language, and how our social interactions shape who we are and how we learn. He's worked on some amazing initiatives that promote equity and inclusion in schools, helping to create learning environments that support students from all kinds of backgrounds. We'll be learning from Dr. Wortham today on making schools a better place. My mom sits in on his classes at UPenn, and she comes home giving me these mind-blowing philosophical arguments. So, without further ado, Dr. Wortham, welcome to the Kindness Code. I'm so excited to have you here.
Thanks very much. I'm happy to be here.
So, I really wanted to ask you this. You've been a leader at two amazing institutions, Boston College and Penn GSC. How do you approach creating an environment where every student feels included and supported, especially when they come from such different backgrounds?
I think it's an excellent question. One of the things you have to understand about students is that they come from a lot of different cultural and linguistic traditions. So you have people coming into your school, whether it's a K-12 school or a university, and they have different expectations about how people behave and how it is that you're supposed to speak and when you're supposed to speak. And you can't really include people unless you know something about the expectations that they come with. These expectations are often connected to pretty strong judgments. So if somebody violates a rule that you take for granted, you might think there's something wrong with them. They're rude or inappropriate. But from their perspective, it might be that they're doing something that's just perfectly normal and recognizable. For example, in some cultures, when you have a group of people and they're talking with each other, it's considered extremely rude if you don't let every single person speak once. So if you have something to say, then you're not allowed to say anything else until everybody else in the group gets to talk. And if you have to sit there and be quiet and wait for that last person to actually say something, you have to sit there and be quiet and wait. It's a way of expecting that everybody does have something to contribute and that we need to give them the space they need in order to decide what they'd like to say and say it. But you can see how this could cause a problem if in most American schools, that's not a rule. You know, in most American schools, somebody can talk and then they can talk again just 2 or 3 turns later, and everybody might be annoyed at them, but that's not considered hugely rude. So if you have a typical American school, but you have a couple of kids who come from a cultural tradition, like a lot of Native American societies are like this, where the expectation is that everybody will have a chance to speak before anybody else speaks a second time, people would misunderstand each other. You know, you would have people on one side thinking, why am I waiting around for that guy to talk? But on the other side, they're thinking these people are really rude because these people are speaking up twice and 3 times before I even have a chance to say anything. So inclusion requires you to do a little bit of research that if you didn't come from a society like that and you're not familiar with it, there's no reason you should know about that tradition or expectation about giving everybody a chance to speak. So you, let's say you were the teacher in that context, you would have to do some research and figure out, well, what are these students, where do they come from, what do they expect when they get together in a context like this? So that kind of means that in order to do high quality instruction that actually is sensitive to people's cultural backgrounds, you need to be like a little anthropologist. You have to go and figure out who you've got, how they behave, what they expect. And that's preliminary work you need to do before you even start.
Okay, can you share a story where you saw this kind of inclusion in action and it made a real difference in the way students learn or interacted with each other?
Here at Boston College, we have a school that is for students with significant disabilities. So some of the students are blind or they're deafblind, they can't hear and they can't see. Some of them are in wheelchairs. And a lot of times when you have people in a classroom who say can't see that well or can't hear that well, that most people aren't used to that. And so we just keep talking the way we always talk, and we keep writing on the board the way we always write on the board and displaying whatever we're displaying on our devices. But I had a professor here who himself was blind, and he was always very good about trying to anticipate the needs of diverse kinds of learners in the classroom. So he would always try to pay attention to whether somebody didn't hear quite as well, and then he would slow down, or whether somebody was an English language learner, and so it was a second language for them, and they needed him to speak more slowly, or when somebody was visually impaired, and they needed him to magnify what it is that he was displaying on his PowerPoint display. And he was always trying to anticipate that maybe there are people in my classroom who don't have the usual way of being able to see or hear. And he thought that it was his job to try to respond to them preemptively. They have this approach called universal design for learning. And he was one of the people who helped develop this initially. And it just means you want to prepare your materials if you're teaching in such a way that those materials are accessible to people no matter what limitations or strengths and weaknesses they might have. And that's turned out to be a very powerful way of trying to make things accessible to all sorts of people in advance. You don't wait, and if somebody says to you, hey, I can't hear you, you respond. In advance, you make your materials so that someone who, say, needs to slow down the audio so they can hear it more clearly, it's available to them in a way that they can slow it down, and that way they don't have to feel bad about asking for any extra treatment or something. They just go to a different channel and they're able to listen in a different way that suits whatever their needs are.
So, do you think online learning helps solve this problem, or do you think it makes it worse?
I think it can do both. So I think that online learning can allow you to adjust for things. Again, somebody needs to have the audio a little bit slower, or somebody needs the video enlarged, or somebody needs to be able to watch the lecture twice. That all of those things are much more easy with technology, that you can adjust your materials in ways, and the technology facilitates that. Whereas if you were in a classroom and you didn't have any technology and the teacher was speaking, it's much harder to allow one student to slow it down or speed it up or enlarge it or whatever. So I think that technology can be great in terms of giving different opportunities for people with different backgrounds, different expectations, different needs. But of course, technology is also limiting because not everybody has access to the same technology. So some people have great technology available to them at home, but other people, their parents can't afford to purchase that technology, and so they don't have access to things to take advantage of various interesting new learning opportunities that the school might provide. So I think that technology can be good and technology can be bad. And again, the crucial thing is awareness. You have to be aware of who are my students, what do they need, how is it that I could offer them things that would be more useful to them given their linguistic background, cultural background, various sorts of needs. And once you're aware of it, then you can try to use the technology to help as opposed to letting the lack of technology or the limitations get in the way.
If you were to build your dream school from scratch, what's one thing you'd add that isn't part of schools today?
You mean this seriously, right? You're not talking about laser tag or something? I can't say I want to add laser tag.
Seriously.
So one thing I really like to do is I like to ask what I call essentially contestable questions. So an essentially contestable question is a question where there's more than one answer that's really plausible. A lot of questions, there's a clear answer, like what temperature does water freeze? Well, water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. And once you know the answer, you know the answer. There's no opportunity for conversation about that question. So there are some questions where you know the answer to the question. Maybe you don't know, but you can find out, and there's no room to talk about it. You just have to go find the right answer. And then there are other questions that are value questions. So a value question is a question where it really doesn't matter how much we talk to each other. We're just going to disagree. Like, I don't like tomatoes. You like tomatoes. Doesn't matter how much you talk to me about how great tomatoes are. I don't like tomatoes. That's just the way it is. So that's a value question where, again, you can't have a good conversation about that because you like them, I don't. That's the end of the story. But there's a third kind of question. You could call it an interpretive question. It's a question where reasonable people can really disagree about the answer to that question. And so I think that we should have a lot more of these interpreted or essentially contestable questions in schools. I have a child, when he was in second grade, I was invited to come into his classroom and talk to the students. They wanted parents to come in and talk about what they did. And so I came in and I talked about how I taught in college, and I asked the students one of these essentially contestable questions. The question was, are humans essentially different from animals? So I said, when you have a child, how do you teach the child not to run in the street? Or how do you teach the child not to touch the stove when it's hot? And isn't that exactly the same way that you teach the dog? You don't want the dog to jump on the bed or the couch. You don't want the dog to do certain sorts of things. So with the dog, you reward it and punish it. And with the child, when you don't want the child to run in the street, you reward and punish the child so that the child doesn't run in the street. So my question to these second graders in my son's class was, so do you think humans are essentially like animals because we all learn the same way? Or do you think we're really very different? And we had a good conversation about that. Some of the kids had very strong feelings about whether they were really fundamentally like their dogs. Humans are more complicated than dogs, of course, but are they really basically the same because they basically learn in the same way? And I think that schools need more of that kind of question. They need an interpretive question or an essentially contestable question where the teacher doesn't know the right answer, that I don't know the right answer to whether humans are fundamentally like animals. In some ways, it seems like we really are, and in other ways, it seems like we're not. And I think reasonable people can differ about that. And in fact, reasonable people do have different opinions about that question. And I think schools would be a lot better if we talked about questions like that and people had to build arguments about them, as opposed to just learning things that somebody already knows the answer to.
How do you think schools would improve if they asked students that kind of question?
I think that students would become more inclined to reflect deeply and to pursue their own answers to things, as opposed to just trying to figure out what the teacher wants them to say. So I have another child, a daughter, who in high school, she was reading a novel that I had read that I really liked. And she came home from school and said, I'm reading this novel. So I wanted to talk to her about it. I liked that novel. So I thought it would be cool to have a conversation about it. And what she said to me was, Dad, shut up. I just want to figure out what the teacher wants me to say so I can write the paper so I can get an A. And she had been trained to do that. She had been trained. This was a smart person. She could have asked interesting questions about that novel. But instead, she had been trained just to say whatever it was she thought the school wanted her to say. And that's a shame. It's a shame where you get people who are sort of reduced to just giving the answers to questions that everybody else knows the answer to already. I think that if we used more of these essentially contestable questions, then you'd have children who would be spending more time thinking hard about what do they believe, why do they believe it, what answers could you give, how would somebody else give an alternative kind of answer if they didn't agree with you, how would you respond to that person and their argument if they don't agree with you. I think that sort of conversation is a more productive way of engaging with learning.
So going back to inclusion, do you have any piece of advice for kids and teens?
Well, as I said at the beginning, I would encourage you to spend time learning about people from different backgrounds, with different abilities, with different interests and different languages, because the more you know about the different ways that people from various places approach the world, what they expect, what makes them comfortable, what's important to them, what they value, then the easier it is to figure out ways to include them such that they can participate in whatever you're participating in. There may be reasons that you've never heard of. It's not your fault you never heard of them. I mean, why would you know about that? But if there are kids in your class who come from some other cultural tradition, then if you could figure out what it is that they expect, how they typically think about things, then you could engage them in a way that would be productive. So I would say try to be curious, try to learn about different people and their different perspectives. And once you learn about them, see if you can figure out ways to respond to them in their own terms, in ways that they would find comfortable so that they can feel invited.
Thank you so much for joining us today on the Kindness Code. To everyone listening, I hope today's conversation has opened our eyes to how we can all play a part in fostering inclusion, whether it's in our schools, communities, or even in how we treat each other every day. So, Dr. Wortham, thank you again for sharing your wisdom with us.
Yeah, it was great to be here with you.